Welcome to this talk. This one I call Sex and Violence Underwater, and it focuses on the biology of coral reef fish and particularly on their behaviour. So I should introduce myself. It's a photo from when I was a bit younger and could take my shirt off without being too embarrassed. And I gained my scuba diving certificates in my early 20s, trained as a guide in the Blue Mountains, and then I studied biology, including marine biology, at James Cook University in Townsville and Cairns, right next to the Great Barrier Reef. I've spent most of my life since then working on various expedition ships, and some of the first ones were exploring the Great Barrier Reef. So I got to see and take photos of lots of fish, and I'll use some of those images in this talk now. And I've written a series of little books, two focusing on marine ecosystems. And the rate I write books, which is pretty slowly, I figured I could bring out a coral reef book in 2071, but I probably won't produce that book at all now, and just instead do a lecture about it. And if you want to read a bit more about fish and other creatures of the coral reefs, you're welcome to check out my website, ecosystem-guides.com. Just a warning, this talk does contain poo, sex, female to male sex changes, and male to female sex changes. Now, this is not a what fish is that sort of talk. I've got two of them, and I'll add them to the YouTube channel at a later stage. But the next stage after identification is really appreciating the biology of the animal and the plants behind the scenes, the behaviour and life cycle and that sort of thing. And it really adds a lot to the enjoyment of the whole experience. So fish watching is fun. And look, anyone can do it. Coral reef fish watching includes some of the best wildlife viewing on the planet, really. You can get within a few metres of wildlife. You can see a huge range of vertebrate species within a single dive or snorkel. You can watch a range of beautiful and very colourful species, and you can also watch a range of fascinating behaviours. So this is the typical body shape of a fish, the one that most people are, the de facto shape that most people are probably familiar with. Look at a diagram of the fins of a fish, or if you're from New Zealand, the fins of a fish. And you can see, I think all the ones that most people are probably slightly aware of. You've got the dorsal fins along the top or the back. You've got the pelvic and anal fins along the underside or the bottom of the fish. You've got the pectoral fins or the pectoral fins on the side, and you've got the caudal fin, which is basically the tail. And all these variations in fin placement and size can help identify the fish and can really change the way the fish lives. If you want to be a fast fish, a classic modification of a fin is having a sharp dorsal fin, and this can slice through the water. So you think of your typical sharks, and here, for example, we have a trevally. Another variation, and seen again in trevallies, is having these modified reinforced scales along the what we call the peduncle. So that's the section between the tail and the back of the body. Another variation, which is very common in butterfly fish and angelfish, is to be laterally compressed. So the best way I think of that is a dinner plate, and you're looking at the side on, it's quite large and round, and then when you turn the plate on to edge on to you, it's quite thin and harder to see. So that's what we call laterally compressed. And lots of fish, including this tang here, will actually increase or expand the size of their dorsal fin to give a much larger side-on size to a potential predator or perhaps to a mate. For many fish species, especially the larger ones like sharks, larger pectoral fins are very good for increasing stability. And a really amazing example of evolving the pectoral fin is in the flying fish, where it's become a fan-like shape and sits flush with the body, and when it's stuck out, it enables the fish to get lift and fly out of the water and into the air. But that's a whole other lecture. So in terms of senses, of course, we use all our senses and we're all very familiar with that, but other animals have different senses and accent them in different ways. Fish, of course, rely on sight quite a bit, so that's something that we're very familiar with, and the result is that you get, fortunately for us, lots of nice, pretty colours. Some fish have really big, googly eyes, almost comical, and this really allows a much larger field of vision around their body than we have, for example, with our relatively forward-facing eyes. And these big, googly eyes are quite distinct, and they make Steve Buscemi feel a little bit better about himself. Some fish, like this goby, which I photographed from behind the fish, have such protruding eyes from the side of their head that they've almost got a 360-degree view, so they can look behind them. So you can't sneak up on this fish, which is what I tried to do when I photographed it. It literally has eyes in the back of its head, which is kind of like everyone's mum used to have. And some fish, like parrotfish and wrasse, quite obviously can move their eyes rather independently, so the left and the right move in different directions and speeds at the same time. Another thing that makes Steve Buscemi feel a bit better about himself. Now, there are some blind fish. There's even some fish with no eyes. What do you call a fish with no eye? Fish. In terms of sound and hearing, sound does travel better and faster underwater. In fact, it's about 4.5 times faster underwater than it is above in the air. And additionally, sound travels slightly faster in saltwater than in freshwater. So some sounds that fish make are unintentional sounds, like chewing from parrotfish, for example, which are quite loud eaters, and other activities such as going to the toilet, which of course we can all identify with, making sounds we don't want to be heard. And then there are deliberate sounds, of course, mostly for various types of communication. Some fish can use their teeth, other fish will use their swim bladder, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. So it is in fact quite noisy underwater. We tend not to hear things because as we scuba or snorkel, we tend to breathe quite heavily. So if you can slow your breathing down, and look, we don't recommend stopping your breathing, especially when you're scuba diving, it's dangerous. But if you slow it right down, calm down a little bit, you can start to hear a lot more sounds underwater. And there are scrapes and knocks and clicks and squeaks and groans and booms and thumps and rumbles and grunts and drumming and all sorts of sounds. It's even louder than the sounds that come from your husband on the toilet in the morning, or so I've heard. And then to hear all this, fish do have ears, and they have a thing called an ear bone, which is the otolith. And it's a subject that strikes fear into every marine biology student, because at university we used to practice cutting the fish open and to get to their otolith and then having to grind them down. So it's very smelly and it's very boring and tedious. But the otolith is very handy because it can be used to age the fish, and it can be used to identify different species as well. but I don't want to talk about otoliths again. Now, being in a low gravity environment, fish are often heavier than a land-based equivalent of the same size. And fish instinctively know how much they weigh. Do you know how? Of course, it's because they have their own scales. Now, fish have another sense connected with their scales, and it's a horizontal series of scales called the lateral line. And these scales can actually detect pressure changes in the water. So that's why it's quite difficult to catch or even get near a fish underwater. They can feel the tiny bow waves made by our body motion just ahead of our body as we approach them. And so you can get close, but you can never quite touch the animal. In fact, I think one of my girlfriends must have had a lateral line. So here we are looking again at the outside of the fish, but let's strip away the scales and look at the inside of the fish. You'll be familiar with the inside of a fish, of course, if you like to eat seafood or you catch your own fish and process them. And a lot of the organs, of course, will be familiar because we share the same organs. But the one that really is interesting here is the air bladder, or often called the swim bladder. And this organ is very important for a fish. It can do a couple of things. It can make and receive sounds for many types of fish, but more importantly, it controls buoyancy. It can allow the fish to float in place with very little effort, and this is called maintaining your neutral buoyancy. But by changing the size of the gas-filled organ, it can also change its depth with not too much external effort. So by expanding the swim bladder, it can make the fish float up. And inversely, by contracting the swim bladder or making it smaller, the fish sinks, basically, in the water column. Now, when the depth is unnaturally changed, so for example, the fish is hauled out of the water by by a fisherman, the swim bladder, unfortunately, can often be forced out of the mouth of the fish as it dies. So not a good way to go. But like fishermen, we all got to eat. And one of the bigger eaters of the reef, or one of the most obvious eaters of the reef, of course, are parrotfish. You'll see them and you'll hear them feed. So they're quite busy scraping algae off the coral. So again, if we strip away the scales of a parrotfish, you can see inside they've got quite an interesting arrangement of bones. They've got their outer serrated teeth, which look like a sort of a bird beak. That's one of the reasons they're called parrotfish. And when they scrape algae off the coral, it's scraped off with these teeth, with these sharp teeth, and then taken in, of course, through that first set of jaws, and then they swallow the food. It's then taken inside, and it goes through a second set of jaws, the pharyngeal jaws, and basically crushed again. So when this algae is consumed, the broken down coral, the sort of leftovers, the side effect, is basically pooped out as nice, fine, clean sand. And they found in research that individuals of the two biggest parrotfish species process several tons of coral a year into sand. So in fact, many of our beaches are made up of a lot of parrotfish poo. Something to remember next time you lie out on one. Then there are fish that specialise on feeding on the living coral, and like butterfly fish, for example. And they can often be recognised by their little pointy snouts, their little pointy mouths, that they need to pick at the protected coral polyps. Then there are the piscivores, and these are the fish that feed on other fish. And the biggest bony fish on the reef are the gropers, or groupers as they call them in the Americas. And these are essentially sit and wait predators. They have a massive buccal cavity, which means that the inside of their mouth, inside of their head, is very, very large. So when they open their mouth, water gets sucked into that buccal cavity very quickly. So whatever is outside their head, immediately outside, in the water, will also get sucked in. So a very effective and quick way to capture food, just simply by opening their mouth. And people have been killed by groupers or gropers, usually by accident. Spear fisherman off Florida in 2006 shot one, but when the fish hit in a hole, the man was tangled up in the line and drowned. And there was a report of two kids in Mexico in the 1950s jumping off a jetty, and only one came back. It was thought the other child was swallowed by the local species of groper called the Goliath groper. And my favourite story, in a fish factory in Cairns when I used to live there, in fact, they split open a groper and a human head rolled out. So you can imagine this was quite a big story in the local newspaper. And it was thought to be a fisherman who had disappeared off his trawler the weekend before. He likely drowned and then was torn apart, by currents over the coral or by a shark. And then his head was probably just rolling past the groper, and the groper basically just swallowed it. So we don't want to tell you all these things until you get into snorkel. Now, in another study on a smaller member of the groper family, observations were made at a coral reef site of these smaller gropers, often called coral cods, that were working with moray eel. Now, when the groper spots a small prey fish hiding in a crevice, which it can't get to, it goes and visits the sleeping hole of a giant moray eel. Then the rock cod sort of shakes its head at the moray, which seems to be an invitation to a cooperative group hunting. The moray eel swims away with the groper, is led to the crevice where the prey hides, and proceeds to probe that crevice, which is too small to let the groper in. And so the moray eel either catches the prey by itself, or it flushes it out into the open, where the groper can grab it. And the gropers also tended to quickly learn to invite preferentially those individual eels that collaborated the most often. Now, there are other predators, such as these trumpet fish, which practice sneaky feeding, and they've been observed quite a lot sneaking up on their prey by hiding behind some of these giant gropers. And then, of course, there are the sharks, and people know them as a predator, of course. And indeed, they often are the top predator on the edge of natural coral reefs, or unspoilt coral reefs on the edge. And in tropical waters, they are a piscivore, so they feed on other fish. So they're not a threat to the one predator above them, which of course is the ultimate predator on the planet. And that, of course, is humans. But we do pay a price when we eat coral reef fish. It's called ciguatera. Now, this is not a sexually transmitted disease that Bill Clinton gave Monica Lewinsky all those years ago. But ciguatera is a disease we humans can get from eating certain types of fish at certain times. It was first recorded by Europeans a long time ago on Cook's ship Resolution. And it's been recorded in over 400 species of fish around coral reefs. And what tends to happen is herbivorous fish consume certain algae. These fish get eaten by other fish. The toxins build up in the food chain. And so not only do predatory fish, such as snappers and gropers, have this, but so do some of the algal eating fish as well, the parrotfish, for example. Now, symptoms include nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, as well as some other lesser symptoms, including some really strange ones like cold allodynia, which is a burning sensation you feel when in contact with a cold. And the symptoms may last just for a few hours, or they may last over 20 years or so, which has happened to a friend of mine who works on a ship. And that's longer than the average marriage. Although I guess with ciguatera the symptoms are a bit less painful. Now, there's no cure as such, but there is one simple way to avoid getting ciguatera. Don't eat fish. Now, there has been studies that have sort of suggested there's some evidence of transmission of symptoms by people that aren't eating the fish, but have caught it through breastfeeding or through sexual intercourse. So, it's always a good idea that you don't have sex with people who eat fish. Simple. Then there are fish that act as scavengers around the coral reef, and these are often fish that are generalists. And these damselfish called sergeants are a good example. Many different types of species of sergeants take handouts from humans where we feed fish, and they'll scavenge. They're opportunistic scavengers. And off the Palm Islands, I once saw them feeding on a dead goat floating in the water. Not a dead float floating in the water, but a dead goat floating in the water. So they do scavenge quite a bit. One of the most interesting scavengers of some sort is the cleaner wrasse, and it's a specialist scavenger that scavenges off the living bodies of other fish, and it basically removes and eats in external parasites of other fish. And this has evolved into a service for fish, for client fish. So clients that want to be cleaned can invite a session by adopting a typical posture or simply by remaining immobile next to a cleaner wrasse cleaning station. So essentially they basically stand in a queue and wait. The cleaner wrasse and their stations have been extensively studied because they're such interesting behavioural situations. And cleaning sessions do not always go well because sometimes the wrasses are tempted to cheat a bit and eat a bit of the client while they're still. And you can imagine this makes the client jump and sometimes swim away. Other clients then refrain from soliciting a cleaning session if they have witnessed the cleaning session go wrong. Cleaners appear to give the impression of trying to maintain a good reputation because they do apparently cheat less when they see a big audience. For example, they've got a long queue of clients that are watching. So it's a fish eat fish world out there. There's lots of ways of avoiding getting eaten. Hiding, for example, and hiding next to someone really big. And so when you are snorkeling, you might pick up a few smaller fish that hang around you that might scare predators away from them. Another example is to hang around with lots of other friends. So this, of course, is schooling, which most people are very familiar with in fish. And schooling works in many different ways, but one of the main ways it probably works is through predator confusion. So the idea it's very difficult for a predator to single out an individual in that group. There's just too many of them. And sometimes I'll do a demonstration of this if I've got a live audience, and I'll get a volunteer to come up, and then I'll gently throw them a single lolly or a sweet, and of course that audience member will hopefully catch it. And then I do it again, but this time I throw a whole bunch of lollies or sweets at them at the same time, and they're not expecting it. And of course, often they won't catch a single sweet or a lolly because they can't focus on one when a whole bunch of things are being thrown at them. So when this little experiment works, they end up with the lollies all on the floor around them. And some of the schools of fish can be spectacular. There are the famous bait balls which form these huge schools, and these are generally types of clupid fish, what are commonly often called sardines and anchovies, things like that. Probably most famous off the South African coast at certain times of the year. But where I took this photo is in the Philippines, where they also occur, a smaller scale, but many more times throughout the year. And another situation I remember many years ago, I was on a ship in Papua New Guinea, and I was walking around the deck at night, and I saw in the ship's light, in the water, surrounding water, a massive shark, the biggest shark I'd ever seen. And I presumed it was a whale shark. And then before my eyes, the shape dissipated and broke apart. And in fact, it was a school of fish that looked and was arranged in the shape of a shark. Now, it could have been drunk. It was quite late at night. But there is the idea that some fish will form specific shapes with their schools. So in terms of hiding, sometimes it can happen in plain sight or with very obvious colours. And when we look at reef fish, we always think of very colourful fish. Now, part of the reason for that is that we tend to notice the colourful fish and we take photographs of them and we look at them more. The other reason, of course, is dull fish tend to blend in the background quite a bit. But bright colours can work as camouflage. So a combination of bright colours and patterns over the body can break up the shape of the fish that we're looking for. Now, colours can be provided in a couple of different ways. There can be colours provided by pigments, which is the one we're more familiar with. And then there can be colours that appear or change due to interaction with light. These are reflective or refractive colours. With refractive colours, the fish can turn in a different direction, so it's at a different angle from light from the sun, and they can change colour. So this little fish is called a blue-green chromos, and at some angles they appear more greenish, and at other angles they appear more bluish, and they're changing the appearance of their colour by changing their angle. Now, many fish have a false eye spot. Sometimes it's very, very large, as in this example of a butterfly fish. Other times the false eye spot is about the same size as their eye. So in this example of a long-nosed butterfly fish, this false eye is at the other opposite end of the fish from the real eye. And the idea is that as the predator sees the false eye, it's presuming the fish is going to head in one direction, and of course the fish heads in the opposite direction. So this buys just a few seconds for the fish to get away. And for a long time we theorized about this, and it was only a few years ago where scientists actually did experimentally prove that this was a real effect. Now, for this to work, and the false eye spot to work on a predator, you also need to hide your real eye. So the way you can do that is by having a darker stripe go across the head and then continue through the eye as well. And this is very common. You'll see it in many different species in unrelated groups, including butterfly fish and, for example, the tangs, convict tangs here. So fish change colour. They change colour over their life, of course, and they can also change even more immediately right in front of your very eyes when you go snorkeling. Sometimes it's to reflect an emotional state. Other times it's to match the colour or the light of their background. And I'll do this through something called chromatophores. So fish can change colour with pigment-containing cells called these chromatophores. And on a very simple level, they can change from light to dark. And gropers can do this quite quickly under overhangs, and they can expand or contract these darker melanophores which can quickly lighten or darken the whole fish body. Now you can flee, you can hide, or you can fight. Now surgeonfish are quite cute when they're young. That's not my photo, unfortunately. I wish it was, but I stole that from the internet. But they get quite nasty as adults, so they have a spine, a very sharp spine on the peduncle. There's that word again. So that section between the tail and the back of the body. And you can see that spine here because a lot of surgeonfish and tang, which are in the same family, do advertise that dangerous spine with a splash of colour. And I'll have a look at one of those little spines there in the corner and have a little closer look. They do vary in shape and size with different species, and the spines lie flat in a little groove, and when the fish needs to defend itself, it flips or flicks its tail, and the spines pop out like little tiny jackknives. Unlike human surgeons, they don't charge a lot of money for their little procedure. So surgeonfish use these tail spines for defense against predators, including human fishermen, and they use their size, their big numbers in schools, and also those tail spines to intimidate some of the fish that are protecting their own little territories. So to maintain access and collect food, it is important for a fish to have territories. These little humbug damsels, which you may spot when you go snorkeling, they're quite distinct little black and white creatures, and they'll spend their entire life just on one coral head. Some damselfish will actually defend a little territory of farmed algae, and they'll look after this little farm against intruders, and even intruders that hundreds of times bigger than themselves, like us coming along just to snorkel, not even steal their food, but just in that area that they're living. Now there's another reason to have a territory, of course: access to mates, and ultimately your access to sex. In the marine world, most of the actual act of sex is just randomly throwing sperm and eggs into the water. But with the courtship and all the relationship problems that ensue afterwards, there are lots of variations. And in this very complex and high diversity tropical ecosystem of coral reefs, there's almost every variation you can think of. Now there's the more familiar, perhaps boring version that we know, which is where the male and the female look quite similar. The young look quite similar, just smaller obviously. And the male and the female get together for the mating season and then might continue to do that if they're successful, and then essentially sticking together for the rest of their life. But then underwater, it's the typical story you might all know. Girl meets boy, girl turns into boy. And the more biologists look at the sex lives of fishes, the more sex changes they found going on. And it's a lot of sequential hermaphrodism. So one of the most obvious examples that you'll see are parrotfish. And the immature phase, IP, develops into the terminal phase, the TP. So the immature phase are the females, and they grow into that terminal phase of the males during the course of their life. And it's easy to distinguish them, very handy. The boys are blues and greens, and the girls are generally oranges and pinks and reds. And yes, a lot of the women out there are probably thinking the immature phase really should be the males. Well, you can find that variation as well. In the famous anemone fish and clownfish, there is usually one dominant female around that anemone. And then she is surrounded by a group of several smaller subservient males. And she harasses the smaller and subordinate males around her so they don't grow up into females. She doesn't give them the chance to develop the hormones, and they basically stay as immature little boys. Which sounds a bit like an expedition team that I work with. And then something we tend not to think of when we think of fish, but the ideas of intelligence and memory. And the reason we tend not to think of that, I guess, is because the urban myth of the 3-second memory of a fish. It goes around the goldfish bowl, and by the time it comes around, it's forgotten everything that it's seen a few seconds ago. But fish are a lot smarter than we generally think. And what scientists will do is compare the size of the brain to the size of the body. And it's true that most fish do have a smaller ratio. It's about 1/15 of a similar sized bird or mammal. And the smallest brain ratio of any fish, just by the way, is the deep sea bony-eared arsefish. I've never seen one, but that's apparently what they look like. So if you really want to insult someone, implying they're stupid and giving them a silly name at the same time, you can call them a bony-eared assfish. But more recent studies have demonstrated that fish can use mental maps of their surroundings. They can remember colours after several months. They can remember human feeders many months after last seeing them. They can avoid areas where there's been predators, including fishing. They can recognise individual neighbours and competitors, and they can even learn to play Sudoku underwater. Okay, I made that last one up. But clownfish, they found, could remember their mates after not seeing them for several months, especially if they owed them money. So, in conclusion, fish ain't stupid. They have complex and fascinating behaviours, many of which you can watch while you're out there snorkeling. So, please enjoy your fish watching.